International gas and coal prices have surged in recent months. What is behind the soaring energy prices, and how durable could they be?
Of course, now it's suddenly changed because of Omicron, and we've seen oil and gas prices and coal prices all come down pretty substantially right now as the world is in a period looking, is this going to be another real shutdown of parts of the world economy? We still don't know.
Some people are expecting oil prices to reach $100 as oil become a great hedge against the rapidly rising inflation. Others are talking about increasing production and demand being lower, and thus expecting oil prices to go downwards slightly. So your thoughts on that?
I think it's, so much of this has to do right now with what happens with the new variant of the Omicron virus. If it turns out that it's highly manageable, then I think we'll see markets come back again. If we have if this turns out to be something that that the vaccines can't deal with, then we'll see a kind of slowdown. We'll see confidence start to ebb away again.
The Biden administration has announced that it would release 50 billion barrels of crude oil from the SPR. And it is also reported that they may even reinstate a ban on crude exports. Do you think this move will be effective in bringing down gasoline prices?
If there is a ban on crude oil exports, that would be a terrible mistake. It would be a shock to the world economy. It would end up leading, actually, we think, to higher gasoline prices in the United States, not lower gasoline prices. And so I think there needs to be much clearer analysis and understanding that gasoline prices are set by what happens in the world market.
So today we are very delighted to welcome Dr. Daniel Yergin, a Pulitzer-Prize winning authority on energy, international politics, and economics, to share his insights on global energy transition and recent developments in energy markets. He is Vice Chairman of IHS Markit, a global information and advisory firm, and Chairman of IHS Markit's several-week conference, which has often been called the Super Bowl of energy. He has been selected by American Energy Society as Energy Writer of the Year 2020 for his book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Welcome, Dr. Yergin. Thank you for making time to talk with us.
Thank you.
So I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. Let's start from the climate summit, COP26. The COP26 is concluded with a compromised deal on climate. What are your key takeaways from the summit, and did it live up to expectations or fears from the U.S. energy industry?
I think that maybe the most important takeaway is a movement towards agreeing on how global climate markets and carbon markets will work. So I put that at the top. There are also pledges of $130 trillion for sustainability investment. And various other provisions. So they're really kind of steps to implement the 2015 Paris Agreement. There's agreement or pledges on methane, for instance, and a number of other things. But I think I'd put those at the top.
So coming out of COP26, it seems that more and more investors are worried that oil and gas assets will become stranded. So is it inevitable that there will probably be increasingly less capital expenditure going into new oil and gas supply?
Well, I think there is a concern that there is definitely a concern that there's going to be underinvestment in oil and gas, and that's going to lead to recurrent tight markets. This kind of thing that we saw in China and in Europe before and around the time of COP26, where energy prices went way up, basically because of underinvestment. And I think we can look at the numbers that there's underinvestment in oil and gas going on. And I think there's a mistaken understanding. Oil and gas are going to be part of the energy mix for a long time, and people are getting confused about the timing.
OPEC Secretary General Mohammed Barkindo said that oil and gas were targeted for the first time at COP26 as having no place in the energy transition. So what will be the geopolitical implications of the global energy transformation driven by renewables?
Well, first, of course, wind and solar will grow a lot. They're certainly growing a lot in China, which has about half the world's wind and solar capacity installed. And so we'll have a continuing growing energy mix, but oil and gas will be part of it. I think the fact that the oil industry was excluded from COP26 was a really big mistake, because obviously the energy industries are very important to addressing and investing in the future. And let's note that the next two COPs, 27 and 28, one will be in Egypt and one will be in Abu Dhabi, which is an oil exporting country. So there'll be a different perspective. But I think that was a big mistake. And right in the middle of COP26, you had an energy crisis, which is a message saying we're going to have an energy mix and we're going to need all the resources.
But do you think the OPEC will lose some of their influence eventually?
Actually, it's a very interesting question, what will happen to OPEC or OPEC Plus, because one of the questions is if you have declining investment in other parts of the world, will actually the demand for OPEC oil increase? And some of the OPEC countries believe that they're going to gain market share over the next several years because of declining investment elsewhere. And, some of the key countries are spending tens of billions of dollars to actually expand their capacity to export.
Saudi Arabia has heavily promoted the concept of a circular carbon economy with a $10 billion fund for deploying CCE technologies in the Middle East, Africa, and developing countries. What have you heard from the industry about the viability of the CCE?
It's a very interesting question. I just came back from Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, and they clearly are as the Saudis are increasing capacity because they see that investment will be down elsewhere and the world will still need oil. At the same time, everybody's getting on board for their 2050 or their 2060 or their 2070 goals and looking at how do you achieve that? Do you achieve it carbon capture? Do you achieve that with offsets? Do you achieve it with using hydrogen? And so I think kind of everybody has these goals. The question is, how do you actually achieve the goals? And I think that's what's going to be played out over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. And technology is going to be a really important part of it. If you want the thing to be optimistic about is to be optimistic about technology, because that's where the real solutions will come from. But I would say that these goals of carbon neutrality, they're very tall mountains, and people are just starting to climb the mountain, and they actually don't quite know how tall the mountains actually are going to be. And this is going to be not a quick journey. It's going to be a 30 or 40 or 50 year journey up that mountain.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pledged to cut their carbon emissions to net zero by 2060 and 2050, respectively, while both countries are still spending billions to expand their crude oil production capacity. So what is your view on that? What are the biggest challenges for Gulf countries to diversify their economies?
Well, I think all the Gulf countries, they see how the world's changing, and so the very big the key countries are looking really to say, how do we diversify our economies? That's what's behind the 2030 goals plan vision of Saudi Arabia. Abu Dhabi started on it much earlier, I think, but that's why you see Saudi Arabia as an investor in Uber and Lyft. Abu Dhabi has a very diversified portfolio, which is as important to them as their oil and gas exports. So diversification is certainly on the agenda, and it helps to diversify, though, if you have oil revenues. You need oil revenues in order to diversify and reduce your dependence of your economy on oil. And I think that's part of the very much part of the thinking in those key Gulf countries.
So interestingly, President Biden seemed to deliver a dual message in Glasgow. On the one hand, his administration is working with other countries on an energy transition, while on the other hand, he's asking OPEC to pump more oil now. How is the White House dealing with those competing short-term and long-term goals?
I think it's a divided mind, really, that reality came into effect. U.S. presidents always worry about high gasoline prices because high gasoline prices are bad for people who are holding office, and people tend to vote for opponents of it. So President Biden has been in Washington, for like 50 years, so he understands how the politics work. So he has these, big goals for climate in the future, but at the same time, the reality is that most every car in the United States runs on gasoline, and so he needs to worry about energy supplies. And if there are recurrent energy shocks, like we've just seen, as something could happen, that will, I think, force political leaders to kind of rebalance their priorities.
Okay. So, Dr. Yergin, you argue in your book that the world is being shaken by the collision of energy, climate change, and the clashing power of nations. I think one of the best examples that could illustrate these tensions would be the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. How do you view the ongoing tensions among the US, EU, and Russia around this project?
That's a very good question, and that just sort of shows how all of these larger geopolitical issues get involved with energy issues. Nord Stream 2 is a pipeline that cost about $11 billion to build to take natural gas from Russia to Germany. When the first Nord Stream pipe was built, everybody was in favor of it. Now it's become the second one very divisive. It has to do with the larger political tensions around Ukraine, whether this will divert gas that would have gone through Ukraine and would have paid Ukraine $2 billion a year of transit fees. And then there's somehow does this give Russia political influence? My own view is that this is a pipeline. It's natural gas. It's a two-way relationship between Russia and Europe, because Russia also needs things from Europe. Also, I think the structure of the world gas market has changed. The rise of LNG, including the fact that the United States is one of the three largest exporters of LNG. It's an exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, to China. And the fact that the European pipeline system is much more flexible means that there's less political impact and significance in Nord Stream 2. But it's become a very symbolic issue. It's a very big issue here in Washington. Although the Europeans say, well, wait, this is a pipeline that involves us. But I think it's very tied up with the continuing tension and controversy over Ukraine and Russia's relationship with Ukraine. So this is an example of where politics is flowing into energy and into the issues of energy supply.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some recent developments in global energy markets. International gas and coal prices have surged in recent months. What is behind the soaring energy prices, and how durable could they be?
Well, I think we need to diagnose it. I think it really has to begin with the strength of the recovery coming from out of COVID, when it appeared the world was coming out of COVID. And of course, the Chinese economy was going very strong because China, the demand for goods from China is so great. And I think that the energy lack of investment, particularly in coal around the world, had led to tight coal markets. Then LNG, liquefied natural gas, became in short supply, and then oil followed that. And so prices went to levels, and people were talking about $100 barrel oil. Obviously, China, Europe was hard hit in terms of having to kind of ration supplies and make decisions about who got power and manage the system in a very, suddenly under a lot of pressure. Of course, now it's suddenly changed because of Omicron, and we've seen oil and gas prices and coal prices all come down pretty substantially right now, as the world is in a period looking, is this going to be another real shutdown of parts of the world economy, or is this, we still don't know. It's still just early days to understand the new variant. And so that's taken the pressure off the markets, but it's also raised questions about economic growth. It's raised questions about these big supply chain problems, which have been such a problem for the world economy. So I think it's quite remarkable to see in a matter of a week how we've gone from people talking about $100 barrel oil to now looking at, say, where's the floor for the price of oil? Shows how volatile things are and the degree to which the virus still has such a heavy and negative impact on the global economy.
Right, as you just mentioned, in terms of oil prices, we are in a completely different world than we were 2 weeks ago due to the new variant. So will this new wave of COVID and the subsequent lockdowns reverse demand recovery of oil over the winter month? How serious do you think the current the resurgence of the new variant?
I think it's still, unfortunately, as we're speaking today, still early days as really the health authorities try to assess how virulent this new variant is, Omicron, and how transmissible it is. And but you've seen the reaction, at least the initial reaction, was to slam on the brakes, cut off travel from Southern Africa, put travel bans in place and not allow people to come into countries and so forth. There's just such a degree of fear and really worrying about whether the existing vaccines will be a strong wall against this new variant or not. And so I think, it's going to take another couple of weeks to assess it, but it certainly has cast a dark shadow over the world economy and raised a whole new level of fear. So just when confidence is starting to return, once again, it steps back. And we'll have to see. Really, the question will be how effective are the vaccines against this new variant? And that, as much as GDP, will determine what happens to oil and gas prices.
Right. So there are different opinions around where oil prices will be heading in the next few months. Some people are expecting oil prices to reach $100 as oil become a great hedge against the rapidly rising inflation. Others are talking about increasing production and demand being lower, and thus expecting oil prices to go downwards slightly. So your thoughts on that?
I think it's, so much of this has to do right now with what happens with the new variant, the Omicron virus. If it turns out that it's highly manageable, then I think we'll see markets come back again. We'll see demand rise again, because that's what was happening, is that oil demand was getting back to the level of 2019, and the sense that the world economy was working again, and then looking at, in fact, tight supplies. If we have if this turns out to be something that that the vaccines can't deal with, then we'll see a kind of slowdown. We'll see confidence start to ebb away again, and economic growth will not be as high. So it's just it's still something that will unfold over in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I think if we look out the next few years, we do see what I call preemptive underinvestment, lack of insufficient investment in oil and gas to meet demand in the future. And I think people have been unrealistic about demand growth. For instance, if people start traveling again significantly internationally, you'll see jet fuel demand really come back rather strongly, and that will push oil demand above where it was in 2019, and you'll see capacity, that extra capacity that you need to have security in the market, will continue to shrink. So I think we have to look short term. I think uncertainty we look out a few years, we'll see the impact of underinvestment in energy resources, and that will be, that will have an impact on governments in Europe and in North America.
Okay. The Biden administration has announced that it would release 50 billion barrels of crude oil from the SPR. And it is also reported that they may even reinstate a ban on crude exports. Do you think this move will be effective in bringing down gasoline prices?
Gasoline prices have already come down. There's a lag, but because oil prices have gone down 15 or 20%, that will bring down gasoline prices. They've gone down partly on the expectation of this release from Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States and from other countries. But a lot of it is the Omicron virus and the fear that that's created. This was the largest release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that's ever occurred. So it shows you how much they were concerned about inflation, but in particular, the political impact of gasoline prices, because we're only 11 months away from congressional elections, and gasoline prices actually have a big impact on how people vote. If there is a ban on crude oil exports, that would be a terrible mistake. It would be a shock to the world economy. It would end up leading, actually, we think, to higher gasoline prices in the United States, not lower gasoline prices. And so I think there needs to be much clearer analysis and understanding that gasoline prices are set by what happens in the world market. And if you suddenly withdrew 3 million barrels a day, which is what U.S. exports are, that would be a shock to the world market. So that would be a very unwise step to take, I think, in my view. I mean, it's quite different than using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
And the Biden administration also asked other major economies to release oil from their stockpiles, such as China, India, Japan, South Korea, and the UK, some of which have already taken actions. So do you think this unprecedented coordination among oil consumers will put political pressure on OPEC and to push them to do something?
So OPEC Plus was created by really Russia and Saudi Arabia and other exporters to stabilize the oil price. And it was an unusual new coalition in sort of global oil diplomacy. Now you have a global oil diplomacy of the importing countries, the consuming countries, and to have coordination between the United States and India and China and other countries sends a kind of a new message. And countries are very concerned about consuming countries. India imports 85% of its oil, and this is a very big hit on its balance of payments. They've been very clear. So I think it's trying to send a contrary message to the OPEC countries. But I think you do have to look longer term at the underinvestment in oil supplies, which leads to tight markets. That's the basic fundamental. Obviously, the OPEC Plus nations are still looking back a year and a half ago when oil prices actually went below zero. They went negative. That's in their minds. But on the consuming side, they're looking at high prices. And clearly, inflation, a month or two ago in the United States, they still would talk about transitory, temporary inflation. Now I think the recognition is that inflation has been built into the system. The supply chain disruptions we're seeing in shipping and other things have added to inflation, and that's very much on the minds of the consuming countries.
The U.S. has a long history of influencing the OPEC, especially Saudi Arabia, which you offer a couple of examples in your book. So the question here is, how do you view the current U.S.-Saudi relations and the Biden administration's scope for lobbying OPEC to lift production?
Under the Trump administration, Saudi-U.S. relations were very strong and very connected. After all, President Trump's very first foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia. Normally, the president makes his first foreign trip to Canada or to Europe or something like that. I think relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia have been more tense with the Biden administration. There's some signs now of trying to improve the relationship, but I think there's a distance that's there between this administration or many of the people and views in this administration and Saudi Arabia. Obviously, historically, it's been a very close relationship between the two countries, and I think the underlying connections will continue, but there isn't the same, shall we say, cordiality that existed under the last administration.
So would Biden rush to conclude a deal with Iran in order to get more OPEC oil on the market?
I think from the signs, it's going to be pretty difficult to do a new nuclear agreement with Iran because Iran has continued to progress on its nuclear program. And obviously, having once made a deal and then having it not continue, Iran has a different government now, a different president. And obviously, Iran is saying, what you need to do is lift the sanctions. We need to put more oil into the market. But one of the things that's striking is that Iran already got a fair amount of oil in the market. So even if Iran came back, it'd probably add only 1 million or 1.5 million barrels a day of oil. So it's not as big a deal as it would have been a couple of years ago. But I think that's a really tough negotiation. The sides will work at it, but it's probably more difficult now than the original agreement.
Okay.